Delighted that Doug Brinkley is back here again in Washington to join us. Doug is director of the Eisenhower Center at the University of New Orleans and has done a couple of other programs here before, including a previous book that he worked on with the co-author of this book when he discussed his book on Forrestal. But Doug is here, along with co-author Townsend Hoops, to discuss FDR and the creation of the United Nations. Would you please welcome Doug Brinkley?
Thank you, Judy, and I might say it's nice to be here at the National Archives. When you're a history professor, this is a place you get familiar with for spending hours looking at documents over the years, and I've spent a lot of time here, and I've also become very close friends with Judy, who runs this, I think, marvelous program to give people an opportunity to come during lunch hour here on the Mall to hear about history or fiction or the humanities, contemporary arts in some fashion or another. The book that we're here to talk about is self-explanatory in its title, FDR and the Creation of the United Nations. They're two major topics, and ones that I think are very relevant in this particular week. FDR, of course, because the fourth memorial is being, it's already erected, but it's being unveiled, if you'd like, later this week on the tidal basin, which is going to be, the Washington Post has been running regular stories about it, and it's quite a fantastic monument to Franklin Roosevelt. So the timing, I think, of this topic is important. And the UN is always in the news for something, but in today's paper, I saw that Bill Richardson, our ambassador, who has flown off to Zaire with, it appears to be orders to make a deal to get Mobutu to leave power, to force him into exile or make some kind of deal over there. So I think both topics have a particular relevancy. Let me say that the origins of this book, FDR and the Creation of the UN, came from what I would consider, and Mr. Hoops would consider, a need. There have been some good books written about Franklin Roosevelt, touching on his internationalism, touching on the UN. In particular, James McGregor Burns' marvelous biography of Franklin Roosevelt. Robert Dallek, a historian, has really, I think, done the best book on history of American foreign policy from 1932 all the way through World War II, and has some marvelous information about Roosevelt's post-war planning in the UN. There was a woman named Ruth Russell who wrote probably about, I think it's about 1,000+ pages, a kind of official history of the UN Charter, which we mined quite a bit in the writing of FDR and the Creation of the UN. And that was a valuable book, but very few people could kind of plod through a book like that, which was a government printing book of that duration. And even if you did that, you would have missed a lot of the personality of Roosevelt or a lot of what was going on at some of the wartime conferences. So the shocking thing is that there's never been a book on Franklin Roosevelt and the Creation of the United Nations. There's a good book on Dumbarton Oaks, but there's still not a good book on the San Francisco Conference. So there was a gap there. And we decided that it would be a fascinating and important study to look at the UN, particularly in the wake of George Bush's Gulf War, when really the project started kind of coming into mind, because the UN seemed to have the potential to have a new relevancy in the post-Cold War world. That in many ways, that one could have argued that the UN was about to come onto a kind of new life, that peacekeeping or a peace enforcement were going to be, for the UN, was going to be a wave of the future. That multilateral action with the United States perhaps always leading the UN seemed like a very real possibility. I think today we can say that that's not the case, and I think Mr. Hoops may talk about the contemporary situation of the UN a little bit. But we went about writing the book, and one of the great things is Franklin Roosevelt, as we all know, is such a vibrant character. It's really impossible to study him or write about him or think about him without having some kind of energy flow going through what you're doing. FDR is multifaceted and endlessly fascinating. One of the things that the place we picked up on this book and FDR's story is really with the failed League of Nations, and the fact that FDR in 1920 had given over 800 speeches for the League of Nations. And I think that's a very significant point to hear. Imagine giving 800 speeches on anything. but here's somebody who was really thinking about the League of Nations when he was running as a vice presidential candidate in 1920. And he became I think, a disenchanted Wilsonian idealist. And one of the things we do in the book is kind of track that early Roosevelt mind. How did he think about the League? What did he do? A very interesting article I'd urge some of people to read if you have a particular interest in this subject is the 1923 article that the Saturday Evening Post had sponsored a contest, and it was called the Plan to Preserve World Peace. It was a competition for the American Peace Award, and Roosevelt wrote this essay. And you could see his early ideas as how one would preserve a world peace after World War I. So we looked at some of that, and of course went on to look at Roosevelt at places like the Atlantic Charter or his famous For Freedom speech, the way that he, early on coined the term United Nations, meaning not the post-war organizations, but the United Nations fighting against fascism, and end the narrative of the book at the San Francisco conference with an epilogue that deals with where we're at now, what's happened since the United Nations was created. And we include the UN Charter in the book. With that said, and I think Townsend Hoops is going to address this more, I wanted to read one thing that I just put together for this occasion, and it's one of the parts of this that was fun on this book, I think, is to get familiarized with the number of other important people and the role they played in the creation of the United Nations besides Franklin Roosevelt. Edward Stettinius is one that became very important and very interesting, and I think undervalued in American history as a Secretary of State. Another person who was very important is Arthur Vanderburg or William Fulbright, Sumner Wells, Cordell Hull. And looking at each of these individuals' views on what the post-war world would look like and their contributions to it was one of the, I think, the parts of this project that was most enjoyable. But of the one that I really took a shining to and I've become very fascinated with is Archibald MacLeish, the poet, three-time Pulitzer Prize-winning poet. So I'll just read to you a little something about MacLeish and the notion of a poet coming in and helping to sell the United Nations to the American people, and the language that MacLeish contributed to the UN Charter, I think, is a kind of underappreciated story. And then I will go ahead and introduce Townsend Hoops. Poetry and public service are usually deemed conflicting vocational impulses in America. Write a poem and official Washington labels you, at best offbeat, at worst a mad-eyed subversive. Yet some of the world's most celebrated poets, Victor Hugo, William Butler Yeats, St. John Pierce, George Sepphoris, Pablo Neruda, to name just a handful, have all distinguished themselves in the halls of government as well as in verse. But in the history of 20th century American letters, one individual was able to glide through both worlds with undaunted ease, the three-time Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Archibald MacLeish. A Midwesterner by birth, MacLeish was one of those rare birds who excelled at whatever he set his mind to: football, law, journalism, library science, diplomacy, education, playwriting. The prodigious, multidimensional MacLeish rarely knew failure. From the beginning of my more or less adult life, MacLeish wrote Felix Frankfurter in 1939, I've been plagued by the fact that I seem to be able to do more or less well things which don't commonly go together. That year, with the grim smell of World War in the air, MacLeish obeyed Franklin Roosevelt's summons and quit his teaching post at Harvard to accept the nomination to become Librarian of Congress. Many of MacLeish's literary friends, including Ernest Hemingway, urged him not to take the library post, but MacLeish felt he couldn't let FDR down. A firestorm erupted when MacLeish's nomination was publicly announced. A poet was not fit for government service, the Republican right charged. The left claimed that MacLeish was not an artist, but as Dwight MacDonald phrased it, an establishment power guy on the make. The New York Times immediately went to MacLeish's defense, saying, quote, so warm and generous of spirit, keenly sensitive to the finest cultural tradition, aflame with liberty, can hardly be a danger to the Library of Congress. But after an ugly confirmation hearing, where Senators Warren Barber of New Jersey and Warren Austin of Vermont assailed MacLeish as being a communist, the 47-year-old poet, in a close vote, was awarded the librarian's post. McLeish took over the library in October of '39 and became an immediate fixture in Washington. It was, a colleague wrote, as if a brush of the comet had swept down on an institution that had laid moribund for decades. The Library of Congress became a literary salon under McLeish's stewardship, with everybody from John Dos Passos to Carl Sandburg stopping by for visits. Even though the United States was fighting a two-front war, McLeish managed to dramatically reorganize the library, creating cultural outreach programs and zealously extending the Institute's holdings. And although McLeish's poetry was dimmed by administrative duties, his inspired America Was Promises was published in 1942 to great acclaim. In Walter Lippmann's judgment, this nationalistic paean was, quote, one of the half a dozen greatest poems ever written in this country, and the greatest written about this country since the most inspired things of Walt Whitman, unquote. Unfortunately, others pummeled McLeish for wrapping the flag around himself, for patrioteering, as Dwight MacDonald put it. But the more vociferously literary America reputed McLeish for being a propagandist for democracy, the more fulsomely FDR embraced him. Before long, McLeish began writing stirring wartime presidential speeches. When Roosevelt proclaimed, "It is not enough to clothe and feed the body of this nation, for there is also the spirit, and to preserve our democratic way of life, we must muster the spirit of America and the faith of America." This was vintage Archibald McLeish. And while the fashionable Ezra Pound was denouncing Archie as a kike lover from his radio pulpit in Italy, McLeish on his NBC radio show denounced fascist tyranny with democratic aplomb. By November 1944, FDR had elevated McLeish to the rank of Assistant Secretary of State for Cultural and Political Affairs. And his immediate task was to sell the concept of the United Nations to the American people. As one observer commented, the State Department was now a bevy of tycoons surrounding a poet. McLeish took over the Library of Congress, after he took over the Library of Congress, after he took over the assistant secretaryship, one of his first tasks was distributing nearly 2 million copies of a pamphlet on the Dumbarton Oaks Conference, which occurred in 1944 and was really the beginnings, the origins of the United Nations. He made and wrote the pamphlet that 2 million were distributed to, and he also organized teams of State Department experts who gave more than 500 speeches on the UN in 6 months to church, labor, business, and professional leaders in all the major cities. McLeish and FDR were working to try to bring America onto this idea of the United Nations while the war was going on in 1944. Then on April 6, 1945, FDR asked McLeish to prepare a speech which the president intended to deliver to the opening session of the San Francisco Conference, where the United Nations would leap from blueprint to reality. 6 days later, FDR died in Warm Springs, Georgia, and it was up to McLeish to write the official proclamation of Roosevelt's death. I might also add that McLeish was one of the two last people FDR dealt with on business before his death. Before leaving for Warm Springs here in Washington, he spent a great deal of time with McLeish, concerned about making a good speech at the UN and working with McLeish on it. Later, in a more personal elegy, McLeish compared FDR's demise with Abraham Lincoln's, proclaiming, quote, "We did not know we would weep so for him. We did not know we would sit in our chairs, at our desk, our hands still. There are many who loved him, but even those who loved him did not know." Well, the death of FDR strengthened McLeish's pro-UN resolve. No more realistic and sensible or necessary labor was ever undertaken by any meeting in the history of mankind, McLeish wrote about the San Francisco Conference. When McLeish read a near final committee-composed draft of the legalistic UN Charter, which we include in the back of our book, he nearly blew a gasket. He wrote Secretary of State Edward Stettinius that, quote, he had never seen a more complete literary and intellectual abortion, unquote. And he asked for permission to write at least a UN preamble, which McLeish composed here in Washington in his kitchen in one long ringing sentence like a bell toll for freedom. So the actual preamble to the United Nations Charter was written by Archibald McLeish. So this week, as we're honoring Franklin Roosevelt by unveiling the new memorial on the tidal basin in Washington, we must also not forget FDR's living legacy, the United Nations. We should also pay tribute to some of these other people like Archibald MacLeish, who I think have done so much for this country and have been unsung for their efforts to create the UN. Now, I wanted to stop with that, and I just wanted to give a kind of vignette of one of these characters, but one of the things we try to do in the book is, I think, flesh out a number of these people and show the role that they played while the war was going on for post-war organization. And with that said, I'd like to introduce my co-author for the second book. We worked together on a book called Driven Patriot, The Life and Times of James Forrestal, and that's Townsend Hoops. And I think most people in Washington and many people in America are familiar with Townsend Hoops' distinguished career. I won't give you a resume of his positions in government that he served with distinction for many years, but I can tell you when we were working on the Forrestal book, it was amazing for me as a young historian because he had known Forrestal as a young man, and in fact worked briefly for him. So that that feel he had for somebody like Forrestal, I was always fascinated, and I think it enriched that, it made that history of Forrestal come to life. Beyond that, he held many posts in government, in the Defense Department, he was Undersecretary of the Air Force. But I'd like to just mention the books that he's written that are just really some of the finest things in the literature of American foreign policy. One is the book Limits of Intervention, which came out in 1969 when the Vietnam War was raging, and it was a book written by somebody inside the Johnson administration. One of the lucid analysis of Vietnam still. It's in print. It's everywhere. We teach it. I'm a professor at the university. We teach Limits of Intervention. And it's just such a strong explanation, rational explanation of our missteps in Vietnam and without putting blame on one or two people on looking at where the United States went wrong in Vietnam. And then the other book that I'd want to mention is The Devil and John Foster Dulles, which remains the best single-volume biography of Dulles, which Townsend Hoops won the Bancroft Prize for History in, which was as most of you probably know, for the best book on American history in that given year. And we've also, as I said, worked together on this book on James Forrestal, and it's always a privilege because I respect him so much, and he's, I think, just a brilliant mind on foreign policy, and also quite a gifted writer, and that's my friend, Mr. Townsend Hoops.
Thank you very much. That's the kind of introduction you have to pay for. It's quite true, and I'm delighted that Doug set the scene as he did, because, as was once said, a president is many men. And while it's absolutely true that the United Nations is an American creation and specifically would not have happened without Franklin Roosevelt, nevertheless, it was the work of many hands. As Douglas has told you, this book really concerns the conception, gestation, and birth of the United Nations. It ends in 1945 with the San Francisco Conference and the Senate ratification of the UN Treaty. That is the end of the book. I will stick to a narrative of that period. If there's time and if you can sustain more, we can stretch the envelope and talk a little bit about the UN during the Cold War and also at the present time. But the first glimmering of what was to become the United Nations appeared at the first meeting between Roosevelt and Churchill in Argentia Bay off Newfoundland in August 1941. And recall just for a moment the world situation at that time. We were not yet formally in the war, but the administration and much of the country were fully committed to sustaining Great Britain. The U.S. Navy was in fact fighting a nasty, semi-secret war against the German U-boats in the desperate effort to maintain the vital supply line to England. This was a segment of the larger global conflict that Churchill called the War of Groping and Drowning. Britain still faced heavy bombing attacks. Russia was recoiling before the German onslaught, which had begun just 2 months before. and the United States was moving inexorably toward a showdown with an expansionist Japan. The primary purpose of the Argentia meeting was to manifest common cause between the only consequential democracies that had thus far survived the designs of the Axis dictatorships. Out of the meeting came the Atlantic Charter, which pledged the United States and Britain to a new world order based on the principles of freedom and justice. 6 months before, Roosevelt had proclaimed the four freedoms in his State of the Union message: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And these became the moral cornerstones of both the Atlantic Charter and the United Nations Charter. The Atlantic Charter was indeed a revolutionary pronouncement for American diplomacy, representing a total break from the narrow isolationist policies of the Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover periods. Discussion at Argentia was based on a British draft that was the personal handiwork of the Prime Minister. It called, among other things, for the creation of, quote, a new effective international organization. Franklin Roosevelt rejected the phrase for two reasons. First, he was not prepared to give further ammunition to the still formidable isolationist opinion in this country, bearing in mind especially the fact that we were not yet formally at war. But more basically, he wanted no new international organization of any kind until the United States and Britain had functioned as a world police force for several years after the war, had disarmed the aggressors, and had created a stable international situation. Even for the long term, he believed that the police function must be the exclusive responsibility of the great powers. In his view, the League of Nations had failed because it had relied almost solely on moral condemnation as a deterrent to aggression. It was toothless. It was far too idealistic for world realities. In this discussion, as Douglas has mentioned, the President revealed himself as a thoroughly disenchanted Wilsonian, indeed, a hardline advocate of realpolitik. But while he refused to approve the phrase international organization, and organization was the negative code word, he did accept similar language, to wit, quote, the establishment of a wider and permanent system of general security. Post-war planning began right after the attack on Pearl Harbor. On New Year's Day, 1942, 26 nations, many of them defeated and represented by governments in exile, signed in Washington the Declaration by United Nations, in which they pledged to wage war with all their resources and not to sign a separate peace. Franklin Roosevelt thought up the name United Nations and sold it to Churchill by bursting in on the Prime Minister while he was taking a bath at the White House. He also began referring privately to the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China, and recall that we're talking here about Chiang Kai-shek's China, as the four policemen. And this distinction between great and small nations became a basic element of U.S. planning. Sumner Welles, the Undersecretary of State and a close Roosevelt confidant, was the designated post-war planner. Welles was a brilliant diplomat, but with more faith than his boss in the Wilsonian concept of respect for the sovereign equality of all nations, great and small. Feeling that Woodrow Wilson had lost his leverage in Paris by waiting to write the peace treaty until the fighting was over, and the victors were determined upon a revenge which proved self-destructive, Welles wanted to establish an interim UN organization immediately, that is to say, in 1942, to provide at least a forum for anticipating and preempting all of the fractious issues that arise from all wars. For example, territorial claims, ethnic rivalries, and pressures for decolonization. His intent was the expression of a passionate determination not to repeat the terrible failure of 1919. Okay, sorry. But it was much, much too fragile a proposition for the harsh realities of 1942. For the President, it was simply politically impossible. This was the darkest hour of the war. The Pacific Fleet was shattered. American outposts in the Philippines and elsewhere were being overrun and brutalized. There remained grave doubts about the staying power of Britain and the Soviet Union, and Senate approval of anything resembling a UN treaty was totally out of the question. The President's instincts told him he must focus public attention on waging and winning the war, really to the exclusion of all other considerations. Anything else would divert and agitate and confuse a public opinion already battered by bad news. And so he summarily rejected the Welles approach, but it was a tactical decision. A year later, when the war situation was less precarious, he ordered Welles to proceed. The first Welles plan, called the Draft Constitution, contained basic elements of what became the UN. There was a United Nations authority comprising all of the members, comparable to the UN General Assembly today. But responsibility for action was placed in an 11-man executive committee comprising the 4 policemen and 7 others. Police action to keep or restore the peace was the sole responsibility of the 4 policemen. But authorization to use that force required 9 votes in the executive committee, including 3 of the Big Four. This formulation sought to strike a balance between effective police action and assurance that such action would be properly authorized by the broader organization. The British had their own views. Churchill preferred strong regional groupings for Europe, Asia, and the Western Hemisphere, coordinated by only a modest central headquarters. And his primary focus was naturally on Europe, where he wanted a really effective operation, with military units to keep the peace and authority to adjudicate regional disputes. In many ways, this was a prevision of NATO. Because the Foreign Office quietly but tenaciously supported the U.S. position against the Prime Minister, the British gradually came around. But in 1943, no one knew whether the Russians would participate. They were brought on board by the Moscow Declaration announced at a meeting of the Big Three foreign ministers in November of '43. The Chinese had previously agreed. The declaration pledged the parties to continue their united action, to prosecute the war until unconditional surrender was achieved, and then to establish a general international organization based on the principle of sovereign equality of all peace-loving states. This set the stage for the first Big Three heads of state meeting at Tehran in Iran a month later. In terms of the UN question, the most notable thing about Tehran was the President's assiduous courting of Stalin. In 3 private sessions from which he deliberately excluded Churchill, much to the Prime Minister's chagrin. His purpose was to show Stalin that the U.S. and British positions were not routinely pre-cooked before being presented to the Soviet Union. Stalin was very keen about the 4 policemen idea, but in fact preferred Churchill's concept of regional organizations. Nevertheless, on the last day of the conference, he agreed to a strong central UN. For him, there appeared to be no downside risks so long as Soviet security and Soviet ambitions were protected by a blanket veto. And the veto question was rather implicitly assumed, but not formally discussed at this particular meeting. Indeed, the UN was not the formal focus of this meeting at all. The most important decisions taken at Tehran did not concern the UN. A firm date was set for the Normandy invasion, and Stalin promised that the Soviet Union would enter the Pacific War after Germany was defeated. Roosevelt emerged from Tehran in a very buoyant mood and personally drafted the final sentence of a generally upbeat 3-power communique. It read, quote, "We came here with hope and determination. We leave here friends in fact, in spirit, and in purpose." In the light of later events, this was incautious hyperbole. But Tehran had, in fact, achieved momentous undertakings to win the war and consolidate the peace. The president came away from his first encounter with Stalin convinced that the master of the Kremlin, despite his cynicism, could be persuaded that Russia's basic interests lay in cooperation with the West. Asked by a reporter what kind of man Stalin was, Roosevelt replied, "I would say he is something like me, a realist." Churchill did not share Roosevelt's long-term optimism, although he was pleased by the decisions taken on the war and the apparent unity of immediate purpose. He considered Stalin an unnatural man and felt a deep pessimism about future relations. He also left Tehran rather physically exhausted, and he confided his forebodings to his doctor as follows: "We are only specks of dust that have settled in the night on the map of the world. There might be more bloody war. Man might destroy man and wipe out civilization. But I will not be here. I will be asleep. I want to sleep for billions of years." Whatever Roosevelt's judgment of Stalin, he was clear that the post-war peace must be undergirded by real power. In his report to the nation on Christmas Eve 1943, he promised that America would not repeat the disastrous policy of the interwar years based on pious hopes, but would henceforward rely on, quote, "overwhelming military power to halt aggression before it could menace the world." He also asserted that Britain, Russia, and China were, quote, "in complete agreement that we must be prepared to keep the peace by force." Tehran opened the way to detailed Big Four planning for a UN organization, and as Douglas has mentioned, these took place first at Dumbarton Oaks in the summer of 1944, and this led in turn to the General Conference of all UN members at San Francisco in the spring of 1945. I will not, of course, lead you through the labyrinth, the tedium, the bog of these negotiations, but I think it's important to deal with two cardinal points. First, a planning assumption that was both an irremovable fact of life and that turned out to be the principal limiting factor in UN effectiveness. And second, the recurring veto issue, which came close to wrecking both Dumbarton Oaks and San Francisco. In a staff paper of March 1944, the State Department asserted that the new entity would have to be, quote, "founded upon the principle of cooperation freely agreed upon among sovereign, peace-loving states. Nations should retain and will insist on retaining a large degree of freedom of action. No international supergovernment is feasible at this time, even if it were desirable." Advocates of world government or supranational federation, and there were many around during this yeasty period, were of course passionately opposed to retaining the system of sovereign nation states, which they accurately pointed out was a condition of political anarchy and a primary cause of war. The brute fact remained that neither the Big Four nor any of the lesser nations were prepared to yield up any significant part of their claim to sovereignty. Even dependent peoples, striving to end their colonial status, aspired to this same goal of sovereign self-determination. In the middle of World War II, therefore, the nation-state was the only conceivable political building block for creating a new organization acceptable to the great majority of mankind. On the veto question, the United States vacillated between accepting majority rule and insisting on an absolute veto for each permanent member of the Security Council. But beginning at Dumbarton Oaks, we sided with the British view that a big power should not be entitled to a vote if it were itself a party to a dispute. And if no vote, then of course, no veto. To this, the Russians passionately objected. arguing that Big Four unity was at the very heart of the enterprise. There could be no disagreements, they said. Indeed, there could be no suspicions, they said, between and among the Big Four. Otherwise, the UN would collapse. In a word, the Russians would not countenance the idea that the UN could ever be used against the Soviet Union. As it turned out, that was also essentially the position of the United States Senate with regard to the United States. The veto issue was thus encased in ice and beyond resolution at Dumbarton Oaks, and this required the conference to be closed down somewhat prematurely with face-saving statements that did not in fact save much face. The veto issue was carried over to the next heads of state meeting at Yalta in February of '45 and was resolved there. Here there was agreement that the Big Four would have an absolute veto on enforcement actions, but no veto on procedural questions, meaning no inhibition on the placing of items on the agenda for discussion. And this seemed to settle the matter on terms acceptable to all parties. Franklin Roosevelt died on April 12, and much of the world went into mourning. And here let me digress for an interesting paragraph that is purely personal. Churchill said he felt he had been struck by a physical blow. Stalin, who received the news with apparently genuine distress, held Ambassador Harriman's hand for almost a minute before inviting the ambassador to sit down. Chiang Kai-shek left his breakfast untouched to pray. Goebbels told Hitler, "My Führer, I congratulate you. Roosevelt is dead. It is written in the stars that the second half of April will be the turning point for us." There was talk of postponing the San Francisco conference, but the new president was determined to proceed on schedule in accordance with Roosevelt's wishes. And the conference in San Francisco opened on April 25. To the shock and surprise of the Western powers, the veto crisis reemerged at San Francisco and once again threatened to wreck the chances for any workable UN. Molotov insisted on a return to the absolute veto, even on items for discussion. And it thus fell to Harry Hopkins, a close Roosevelt advisor who was already in Moscow to discuss the agitated Polish question, to put the veto issue directly to Stalin. On June 6, he did so. Stalin seemed puzzled. An exchange between Stalin and Molotov made clear to Hopkins and Ambassador Harriman that the dictator was not informed of what his government was saying at San Francisco. After being briefed, however, he commented casually that it was really an insignificant matter and told Molotov to accept the American position. Some believed Stalin was merely playing a cynical game, but Hopkins and Harriman, in any event, believed that his bureaucracy was trying to reverse the Yalta decision. Without this intervention, the UN might well have died in the womb. Now, we come to the end of really the narrative in the book, and I really defer to you. Would you like to go to questions, or do you want to? Well, the only thing we could do would be to talk about the current situation, and I'm prepared to do that, but I don't want to intrude upon possible questions. Shall I go on for 5 minutes? Or? All right. Well, I think it is a kind of miracle that the UN survived the Cold War. Franklin Roosevelt, who I do not think was duped by Stalin, but who recognized that the alternative to a working relationship among the Big Four was, in fact, a splitting of the world into hostile power blocks, and he made that statement publicly in 1943, felt, therefore, that the alternative being so bleak, it was incumbent upon him and everybody to make an extraordinary effort to bring the Russians on board and to make the UN work. And here I think it must be understood that all of the Big Three really regarded the United Nations in 1945 as the extension of the wartime alliance. They assumed that the 3 or 4 great powers, and China was always somewhat dismissed as a great power, would continue to run the world and stabilize it. The hostile power blocks, of course, did emerge, and yet the United Nations managed to survive. I think it was saved from early extinction by its dramatic response to the attack on South Korea in June 1950, a response that combined the firm will and courage of the American president with some really dumb luck. President Truman was absolutely determined to resist. When he heard the news, he told his Secretary of State, "Dean, we've got to stop those sons of bitches no matter what." And he later made quite clear that he would have intervened with or without the UN. The Soviets had been boycotting the Security Council for a month over the issue of who was entitled to the China seat. This was about 6 months after Mao had won the civil war on the mainland and the Chiang Kai-shek government had removed itself to Taiwan. So the Soviet delegate was not on hand to veto the proposed police action. As a consequence, the American-led resistance, which was quickly built into a fairly representative 15-nation military coalition, was enabled to be wrapped in the moral mantle of the United Nations and to fight under the UN flag. This UN action to repel aggression in Korea was the first formal collective security action ever taken by an international organization since the concept was implanted in the League of Nations Covenant in 1919. So I think it seems pretty clear that a passive U.S. response, with or without a Soviet veto, would have resulted in another stillbirth for collective security and a devastating crisis of confidence from which the UN might never have recovered. The post-Cold War period has presented, at least circumstantially, a fresh opportunity for the UN to realize the promise of its founders. But as we are aware, the United Nations, like all of us, now confronts a world vastly different from the world of 1945. There are 185 members in the UN as opposed to 46, and most of the new members are small, fragile, even failed states. There has been a world population explosion, especially in the poorest nations, and this threatens their ability to govern and even to survive. There is an enormous and growing wealth gap between rich and poor nations, which, once muted by distance, is now starkly exposed by pervasive modern communications. This growing political economic chasm creates the so-called North-South polarization and produces a politics of resentment in the Southern Hemisphere, all of which really adds up to tremendous difficulties for achieving consensus in the United Nations. And there have also been dramatic shifts in the alignment of world power. The United States is the only remaining military economic superpower. Russia and the other former Soviet republics are essentially a broken jigsaw puzzle, not forever, but for quite a while. Britain and France are declining middle powers with only modest strength and modest will to play a stabilizing role. China is a clumsy giant, potentially hostile, and without any sense of obligation to the UN. Germany and Japan are both prominent and strong, but excluded from permanent seats on the Security Council by the rigidities of the UN Charter amendment process. And other rising regional powers like India and Brazil do not seem organized or inclined to play a significant international role. A belief that the threat of general war has greatly receded has rendered UN members more reluctant either to use force directly or to provide troops and money for UN operations. They, and certainly including us, are defining their national interests in stricter, narrower terms. It is true that the threat of general war has receded, but as we all know, ironically, the loosening of the superpowers' Cold War grip has unleashed a rash of savage civil wars and ethnic bloodbaths, and the list is long. Angola, Cambodia, Sudan, Madagascar, Bosnia, Somalia, Rwanda, and currently Zaire. Between 1988 and 1994, the world community sought to fill this law and order deficit by pushing the UN into a number of what were essentially intrastate convulsions, which resulted in a vast enlargement of the UN peacekeeping operation. In 1988, there were about 10,000 blue helmets, and they were monitoring a few armistice lines, essentially in the Middle East. By 1994, 80,000 blue helmets were engaged in 17 operations, some of which involved minor fighting. But the scale of this effort was simply not matched by the necessary political, manpower, and financial support from UN members. And this, of course, created a serious overload, caused several failures, and brought on a severe financial crisis that continues, and the jury is still out. It could be terminal if the larger powers, especially the United States, go on declining to pay their dues. What this crisis reveals, of course, is the bedrock truth about the United Nations in particular, but also about all confederations in general. Namely, effectiveness is entirely dependent on the support of the members, especially the most powerful members. If they do not infuse the organization with their own power and influence, it becomes an empty suit, an empty shell. Legally, the United Nations is a committee of equal sovereign entities. The UN suffered a corrosive loss of prestige in Bosnia, but I think it is really unfair to blame the UN for that. The problem was the division and lack of resolve among the leading powers, who were unwilling to take sides and act decisively, who indeed so circumscribed the rules of engagement that the UN Blue Helmets could not even use force to deliver food and other humanitarian supplies, and became passive accessories to starvation and ethnic cleansing. This was a very serious moral, political failure by a divided, unconfident Western Europe and a tentative United States who thought Europe should handle the problem. With the situation drifting toward anarchy and genocide, Washington was finally forced to reaffirm the truth that a stable Europe is a vital U.S. interest and that the Europeans still cannot manage it by themselves. And so, as we all know, we took the lead using the NATO vehicle, not UN. We bombed the Serbs to the negotiating table, and we imposed a kind of diplomatic modus vivendi at Dayton. One dramatic and ironic consequence of the Bosnia and Somalia ordeals is the developing new consensus that the UN cannot fight wars. In October 1995, Boutros Boutros-Ghali, who had led the charge for UN interventions in many places, said, quote, "Enforcement is beyond the power of the UN because members contribute troops on the understanding that their role will be limited to peacekeeping and the troops will be protected." He added, quote, "If it goes beyond passive measures and the troops are endangered, their governments will pull them out. In the future, if peace enforcement is needed, it should be conducted by countries with the will to do it." Several responsible internationalist members of Congress have come to the same conclusion, believing that the term peace enforcement should be struck from the UN vocabulary. These new conclusions are, to say the least, at first glance, stunning. They amount to nothing less than a basic repudiation of the first principle on which both the League of Nations and the UN were founded. The cardinal premise of Woodrow Wilson and the League Covenant was that every member nation would equally and energetically support every League decision to oppose aggression. The UN Charter is even more explicit. Article 43 obligates all member nations to, quote, "make available to the Security Council armed forces and other facilities and assistance in order that the UN can take, quote, effective action for the removal of threats to the peace and for the suppression of acts of aggression. At second glance, on reflection, however, this new consensus essentially unmasks a truth that has always been there, namely, the chasm separating formal prescriptions from the realities where we're dealing with an organization that is a confederation. The League failed in the 1930s because the powerful democracies would not coalesce to resist Hitler. The UN has been able to fight at serious levels of combat only where the United States has organized and led a coalition, namely South Korea and the Persian Gulf. So I leave you with this conclusion. The continuing challenge to the American political system in this context of international cooperation for security is to recognize both the moral and political importance of the United Nations and also its inherent limitations. And the corollary is to acknowledge the enduring necessity for the dominant power to play a steady balancing role both inside and outside the UN. We should be, I think indeed we must be, the leader of a serious effort to strengthen a UN peacekeeping system that is designed specifically to reduce the need for US-led warfighting efforts. At the same time, we cannot avoid the national responsibility, the US responsibility, as the ultimate guarantor of world peace in this particular existing order. Civilization needs a police force. The best available combination today, namely the United Nations, strongly supported by the United States, turns out to be essentially the formula that Franklin Roosevelt fought with all his strength to achieve more than half a century ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hoops, for such an eloquent presentation. And we'd like to invite Doug Brinkley back too and take questions from the audience at this time.
Yes, sir.
To get back to the history that you've written, there was something called either the Commission or the Committee to Study the Organization of the Peace, which had League antecedents. Did you run across that? But more importantly, on your point that FDR, having delivered 800 speeches for the League, then shifted and became disillusioned with the Wilsonian principle, you didn't mention out loud that the fact that the United States did not participate in the League and wouldn't even answer communications at a certain point. Was FDR's fear and apprehension that he couldn't get the American support to really get a strong body, or was it that he decided it just wouldn't work, period?
What period of his thought are you talking about?
Well, you
yeah,
told me about
yeah.
his 800 speeches,
Right.
which was slight news to me.
Well,
and
there
then
was
you had him disillusioned.
Excuse me, there was an enormous time gap, of course. The 800 speeches were made while he was running for vice president in 1920. I don't honestly know in detail, but I think his disenchantment was progressive through the years, and by the time Hitler came to power and the United States was confronted by the rising tyrannies in both oceans, I think he had certainly concluded that moral condemnation was not an adequate deterrent and something more was needed. His instinct was it had to be real force.
You had not been part of that league and organization.
Oh, well, that's right.
Yes, but very important.
Doug,
I think that's a very important point. We really didn't get into the League, but I assume most people know the story of the United States, Woodrow Wilson going over to the Versailles Treaty and then pushing for his 14 points, pushing for the League of Nations, then coming back and not having the political clout to get it ratified through the Senate in the so-called irreconcilables, particularly Lodge, Senator Lodge, sort of firebombed the American participation in the League, and that was always, I think, in Roosevelt's mind in the 30s. I'd also add, keep in mind, Woodrow Wilson was not a popular president. He was seen as many ways as a failure in the 1930s. even when Roosevelt was president. It's really in the 40s that there became what we today call historical, the revisionism. There was a movie that was done on Woodrow Wilson in 1944, and somehow during the war, Wilson started becoming in vogue in intellectual circles, and there was a lot of people looking back at the leagues and either what went wrong, but coming up with their new one world ideas. Wendell Willkie had a best-selling book on this notion of a one world, or a globalism. People like Walter Lippmann were writing on the issue. John Foster Dulles, was dabbling this. James Shotwell and many others were looking at some sort of world federations, and Wilson's name was in a lot of the periodicals, and I think from that point on, today we talk about Wilsonianism and in debates and things in school and international affairs, but Roosevelt was trying to, admired what I think Wilson in some ways, but also saw the political failure of Woodrow Wilson, and the one thing he did not want to do is repeat what Wilson did. And my point really of telling you about Archibald MacLeish, it's a small part of that story, but just that effort to just get on the radio, write pamphlets, let's bring the people along this time, let's not make the mistakes of the League, I think is very much part of the creation of the UN story.
Could I add, excuse me, yes, please. I'll go back to this after you ask your question.
When President Carter was in office and he was promoting the summit at Camp David to promote peace in the Middle East, and now President Clinton is doing the same thing, and the commentators in the media say that should be an item for the United Nations to do.
And your question is? Do you have a question?
Well, I mean, I wanted an answer to whether the United Nations should be involved in
Well,
that.
I think here we come to the root question of power. The United States, because it is a financial benefactor of both Egypt and Israel, has much more leverage, much more clout, is therefore a much stronger mediator or arbitrator than the United Nations. The United Nations in this context is a kind of mush, and they can't call the participants in the hostile conflict to account. I'd like to go back just very briefly. Of course.
When I went to a movie down here was about FDR, and when you were commenting about how they reacted when he died, when Churchill first met the President FDR, he said to him, or the movie said that he said it was like opening a bottle of champagne.
I remember that, yes. I just wanted not to repudiate my young friend, but first of all, the first chapter of this book is called The Ghost of Woodrow Wilson, and it deals with the impasse in 1919 and 1920 here. I believe that there was nothing fundamentally unreasonable about the Republican position. And if Wilson had been willing to make a few compromises, namely to give Congress some kind of voice in the deployment of American forces as part of a League of Nations contingent, he would have got the treaty. He was an ill man, and he was extraordinarily rigid, and as he got more ill, he got more rigid and more isolated. I think he did it to himself and to all of us.
But I also think on that point, the lesson of Woodrow Wilson and that Franklin Roosevelt learned was to bring Republicans along, which you'll see that in 1940 when he appoints Henry Stimson, a Republican Secretary of War, and Frank Knox, a Republican Secretary of the Navy. You can see it, I think, in the concerns throughout this United Nations that it was going to have to be bipartisan. Hence the role of somebody like Arthur Vandenberg. And I think that was a lesson that any politician would take from what happened to the Woodrow Wilson's failure with the League of Nations. If Wilson had brought Lodge to Europe with him, or brought a couple senators over, did some things like that to have a spirit of bipartisanship, the League may have been able to have been ratified much easier.
That's right. Sir.
Could I persuade either or both of you to engage, maybe indulge in a branch of history that's not in great respect, the what-if branch of history? Could you, on the basis of your research and also your experiences and your thinking, I'll use the word speculate on what might have happened if Roosevelt had not died in April of 1945.
May I try that first? I believe that we would have come into confrontation with the Soviet Union, and we might have had something very much like the Cold War, but it would have taken less time to consolidate American opinion behind that view. All of the public information coming from the government during the war stressed that the Russians were potential Democrats, that they were potential partners, that this was all going to work. And when Roosevelt died suddenly, with no chance to make himself the public case for a transition, and leaving President Truman totally uninformed, American opinion wallowed around in great confusion for nearly 2 years, and finally came to a point of resolution in 1947, I think beginning with George Kennan's long telegram, and George Kennan's article, the X article in Foreign Affairs. I don't think the end result would have been much different, because I believe whatever the Soviet position was in 1943, perhaps a basic willingness to accept Eastern Europe as their bastion and to cooperate in the rest of the world, after they stopped the Germans at Stalingrad and the Red Army went on the offensive, I think their ambitions began to proliferate and expand. And they were, of course, ideological world revolutionaries, and this was an opportunity not to be missed. I don't think we could have avoided the clash that ensued.
Might just add to that it's always one of the big debates about FDR and Yalta and his illness, and how did it affect his diplomacy at that period of time. But I think one thing that the so-called Yalta giveaway, as they used to say, but I think you still see Roosevelt in those last days recognizing the Soviet menace very clearly, or the difficulties that were ahead out of Yalta. I think he oversold Yalta to the American people, claiming it as being much more arousing of a success, with the idea that down the line he would be able to fine-tune the agreement, that he would be able to get on the horn with Stalin and say, come on, we got to fix this and I'll fix this, looking at that great personal belief he had in his own ability to as a statesman. And I think it is a tragedy that he did not keep Harry Truman somewhat more abreast. So when his demise occurred in April, that Truman was really dumped with a load of problems, and in one sense was running around, I think, Truman saying, who was at Yalta? What happened at Yalta? What was said at Yalta? Please, and somebody, tell me what deals were made. And I think some of the whole confusion of his Cold War historiography results from what really occurred at Yalta, because Roosevelt's belief in personal diplomacy would kind of work some of these things out, and maybe a little bit of what Whitman kindly would say, he had a great sense of grandiosity, FDR, and I think that we may see a negative side to his leadership by not keeping Truman perhaps better briefed on this. Any other questions?
Sir.
I hate to do this,
Yeah, please.
but I have another one that goes in the other direction. The present situation, and particularly this country's policy toward the UN.
Right.
What do you see as the prospects when we have, without mentioning too many names, people both on the Hill and even in the administration who don't seem to be too keen about even preserving it? One hears frequently the United Nations referred to as by administration types, as a, quote, resource. Well, they're not paying our dues. Now, where are we going from here? Some of us have lived through this for a long, long time. I, as a student, as a young person, couldn't understand why we couldn't get the League of Nations going, why we didn't join, for God's sake. And I've lived through the whole sordid mess, the whole thing in my life, without getting into personal details. But I'm very much concerned, and I know that many people are, probably many people here today, about, where are we going from here? The United Nations will not survive as it is going now, and as long as we as a country or our administration that is, refers to it simply as a resource.
Let me try to answer your question somewhat indirectly. There is this irony in the present situation that all public opinion polls indicate that 70% of the American people give at least passive support to the United Nations. They believe it's a good thing, it's a moral mantle, if nothing else, but it's also a forum for the discussion and the resolution of a number of issues that cannot be resolved by single states, and many of them are removed from the national security era. At the other end of the spectrum, there are perhaps something like 15 to 20% active, vocal, anti-UN activists, many of them concentrated in the Republican Congress. Historically, this is an ideal issue for a president to use the bully pulpit and to transform a passive majority into an active majority that can, in fact, move or bulldoze the resistors. One would think, one would hope, that a president who has now been elected for the last time and doesn't have to run again would use the bully pulpit for this kind of issue. One has to conclude that there's no evidence that he is willing to do so. He seems genetically incapable of not running. And I agree with you that if we do not pay our dues, if we do not provide adequate support over the next 12 to 15 months, we're going to see the shrinking and very possibly the collapse of any effectiveness of this organization, which will face the world with the need either to create splinter groups that do some of the tasks that have no coordination, or to reinvent the UN. It's a drastic historical point. Certainly. Oh, right.
But if 70% of the people supported it, would seem that he would be favorably inclined to come out in favor of it.
Well, you would think so. I can't answer for him.
Well, I think on that point of why the Clinton administration is neglected the United Nations, it's a couple of them. One is the lesson that he had of Somalia and Bosnia, where you had the UN seeming to fail in its peacekeeping missions in the first 2 years of Clinton's administration. He got such bad press on Somalia when the 18 U.S. Rangers were killed, and then also the Bosnians in the UN seemed ineffective, and suddenly the UN, NATO came in and did such a terrific job in at least stopping the carnage. Seemingly, it's looking even more and more successful from at least my perspective all the time with NATO. But beyond that, it's because Clinton was interested in domestic renewal and trade policy of American exports. And somebody like Jimmy Carter looks at democracy with the ballot box, and I think Clinton sees democracy as who can buy American exports or economic democracy. So our foreign policy today, the countries we're interested in of the emerging countries are sometimes not places in Africa, or not places that can't seem to buy and help the domestic economy. In many ways, Clinton's foreign policy is focused here, and the UN seemed not to be able to help what was called by Tony Lake as the enlargement strategy of the United States. So I think it's the Clinton administration is in a, as Townsend Hoops said, we have about a year here to do something about this, and it's the operating cost of the UN equal about the operation cost of the New York City Fire Department. Sometimes we think that the operational cost of the UN is that exorbitant, and it is, and it's not. And there is a need for some reform. But also, I want to stress the UN's not just peacekeeping. It's the World Health Organization, which put an end to smallpox. It's Commission on Refugees. It's UNICEF. It's and as we're having more and more global economic degradation, I think the need for the UN to be having environmental laws of a global stature. Remember, viruses and toxic waste don't know borders. And I think there's an inherent American interest in supporting the United Nations on all these other types of endeavors besides the argument of peace enforcement versus peacekeeping, which needs to be confronted. Bills are going to get paid incrementally, I think, is what the policy of the Clinton administration is now.
The United States pay their dues to the UN, and if not, why do they not pay it?
Well, that takes us back to the other point. There is a very hard core of anti-UN people in the Congress, mostly Republican. Some of them want drastic reform as a condition of paying the dues, and others, I think, simply mask the reform issue from a conviction that they would like to eliminate the United Nations. And here we have, I think, the point about the activist minority who can prevail in the absence of a president going to the country on the issue and transforming the political consensus.
One last question here. We have two, maybe. Yes, sir. Forward or back? Go ahead.
Yes. How did the issue of human rights play in your story, or figure in your story?
Well, I think it's not a prominent part of our story because it was not a prominent part of these negotiations. It of course was appended later, as you know. But what was quite clear about Roosevelt's view was a determination to end colonialism. He was particularly adamant about the French Empire, in part because he had a personal animosity for de Gaulle. But and his death here, of course, played a big role in what eventually happened because Truman was totally uninformed about the colonial issue. The British wanted to preserve not only their own positions in the Far East, but wanted to support France in Indochina because if they didn't, France would not be a willing supporter in Europe, and the British felt the need for a buffer between Germany and also Russia. So the colonial issue got downplayed, but of course as it played out, it played out because the European powers did not have the resources to stay forever. The human rights issue, I must confess, we didn't deal with in any direct sense because it didn't happen before 1945.
Let me just add on the human rights, it's an interesting footnote that it's really the term human rights as we use it today comes in 1948. We're actually the 50th anniversary coming up next year of Eleanor Roosevelt and the Declaration of Human Rights, which is part of the whole United Nations process. But in the period that we're covering this book, it wasn't dealt with directly, but I think it's one of Eleanor Roosevelt's great accomplishments and doing it in many ways, continuing what she thought would be part of the legacy of her husband also. And since Eleanor Roosevelt's been the great champion of human rights, I think President Carter made it then popular in his foreign policy program, and many others have used it as it. But the term wasn't something that people talked about in that kind of way that we do today in the up until 48. Yes, ma'am.
We've seen it's almost impossible for Franklin Roosevelt not to dominate a room, whether he's alive or more than 50 years after he's died. But would you two like to talk about, as collaborators on a book, you've each written a book together before and written books separately. What's that process like for both of you? For me, it's been a wonderful process because I've learned a lot of different things from Townsend Hoops. I've already gave him a puffy introduction. I don't want to do it again. But I think that it's been a wonderful collaboration, and I think one of the things that we have different skills. I'm a trained historian, and one of the things I like are footnotes and archives, and kind of looking for documents or pieces of information, the newest scholarship on those things, and I think I can bring that to the table. I think Townsend Hoops has an entire distinguished career in foreign policy, looking at these issues. As both a historian and as an insider, I've learned on both of these books, from him on that.
Well, just let me add that I think it's a case of complementary skills. He's a much better researcher, but beyond that, he lives and dwells in academia, and therefore he has lines out to new books, to new works in progress that I would never hear about. But he's also, I am possibly a better writer. But it's been a very helpful collaboration, and no doubt aided by the fact that I'm older than he is.
Well, thank you both so much for coming. I'd just like to make a few notes before we conclude and focus back again on Roosevelt for a moment, because it was Franklin Roosevelt who established the National Archives. This building was built during the Roosevelt presidency, and Roosevelt used to come to this very room to watch movies when he was president, and so therefore the theater has always been handicapped accessible, and he came here quite frequently to do that. Also, another thing I thought I would mention, too, is the Archives is best known as the repository for the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Bill of Rights, but we do also have the Charter for the UN, which Doug had so thoughtfully reminded us that the text for the Charter of the UN is in this book. And again, the book is FDR and the Creation of the United Nations, and it's been published by Yale University Press. You can order the book from us, or you can ask for it at your local bookstore. And then a few other things for those of you who are watching from outside of Washington, D.C. Of course, we'd love to have you come here to the National Archives, but some of the other places that were mentioned today, whether it's the FDR Memorial, which opens this week, or Dumbarton Oaks can also be visited. You can visit the room where some of these meetings took place, and it's also a study for Byzantine study. It's a Center for Byzantine Studies. That's Byzantine in the larger sense. And you can visit the Woodrow Wilson House here in Washington, D.C., and also the Franklin D. Roosevelt Library. It was Franklin Roosevelt who established the system of the presidential libraries, which the National Archives now administers, and that library, of course, is up in Hyde Park, New York. So we do hope you'll take advantage of that, and we're going to be concluding now. We'll go down to our museum shop where we're going to have a book signing and invite you all to join us down there, and please come back for more programs. And for those of you who are outside of Washington and would like to know what's going on at the National Archives, you can write to us here in Washington, D.C., or telephone us, and hope to see you here soon. Thank you, and thank you both.
Thank you. I'm doing my best. Just a quickie, if you haven't already.